Project 3 Candy Cars. Last year, I added 2 extra freight cars to my Halloween train as a way to display some candy. One was a steak flat with a bunch of smaller bar-styled candies, and one was a low-side gondola filled to the brim with Skittles. However, both of those cars were just borrowed off of my main railroad, the Willamette and Port Caroni. Now, that was effective, but this year I want something a little more Halloween-specific. And, well, I've got just the plan. Today, we'll be building some Kitwood Hill 4-wheeled ore cars, also affectionately known as Jimmies. Now, these things are pretty small at only 2 inches long. For comparison, last week's tank car is about 6.5 inches, and the coach we're running is 9. However, these kits come in sets of 3, which winds up being around the same length as the tank car, but also gives us 3 separate compartments for 3 separate candy types to put on display, all in about the space of a single freight car. They'll definitely be a little bit goofy, but that's not gonna hurt the Halloween setup. In fact, that's kind of a benefit. The first step to basically any laser cut wood kit is cutting out the pieces. A lot of the components here are a little bit thicker than I'm used to, so it took more force to separate them. Now, I didn't cut out every piece though. Some were not necessary until a little bit later in the project. Before I started recording, I actually started work on one of the 3 Jimmies while following the instructions very closely, just to familiarize myself before I went on camera. You'll actually see the results of that head start in the background of most of these clips. What I learned, though, is that you have to do a lot of work on the frame before you can start on the top and the sides. Because of this, I'm kind of ignoring the pieces for the top and the sides for now. Speaking of frames, for how small these cars are, they are quite complicated. Also really well designed, so it's not too hard to build them, but there are a lot of pieces to keep track of. While it's easy to line up some of them to their correct positions thanks to the other pieces around them, others can be a bit harder. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It's relevant to today's video. Fortunately, the start of the car was a cakewalk to put together. The base had a couple of holes that were the perfect size for some pegs on the sides of the frame to slot into. There was no need for glue even, since the friction alone from the snug fit held everything together. Maybe it was held together a bit too well, however. I wound up having to fiddle with the sides to get them on straight. Once the sides were on, though, the last piece of the main frame was this little bottom brace. Sadly, there were no holes to shove any pegs into, but there were some pegs to help space out the piece correctly. A little bit of wood glue, and the core of our car is coming together. Next came all the hard stuff. I started by adding the ends of the cars, which, in hindsight, was a mistake. Now, the tops of the ends are flat while the bottoms are slightly angled, but that's not the hard part. That's really easy to figure out. The hard part is coupler alignment. There's a hole that's the perfect size for a Kadee coupler box in the middle of the ends of the car. Now, you really want your couplers to be centered on your cars, and that hole on the end pieces leaves no wiggle room. You had better get the ends centered if you want your couplers to be centered. Fortunately, if you do happen to screw this up, like I did on one of my cars, there is a slight workaround that the kit provides. The only caveat is that you would have to run all the cars as a unit rather than as individual cars. Fortunately for me, that was already my plan. We'll discuss this a little more when we actually get to installing the couplers. The detailing on the side of the frame is where things get spicy. Now, nothing here is too hard or unforgiving, but there's a lot of smaller pieces to handle. First is this little bar that goes directly below the car deck and on the side of the main frame. It's followed up with these, bearings? I don't think that's what these are, but calling these knockoff Wario logos is definitely not the technical term. With that said, after the knockoff Wario logos come a couple of tiny rectangles. The biggest rectangle goes in the middle of the car, horizontally, and the smaller ones go vertically over the center of the Warios, covering up the circular holes in the middle. Typically, I like painting wood components before I glue them together. It gives me a finer level of detail by painting each piece individually without the fear of overpainting onto something else. But considering how many of said components were important to the frame of the car, I didn't really want to risk painting too much and warping one of the pieces. So, glue first, paint second. For the frame, I went with Ceramcoat Brown Iron Oxide. It's a very nice, non-distracting, earthy wooden tone. At this point, I felt like getting these cars operational so I could test them. You know, that includes the couplers. As I mentioned earlier, these kits come with what I described as a workaround for misaligned ends. That's not entirely true. It's actually their own coupler system. Let me explain. You screw these pieces of wood in the place of a coupler, with the flat side facing outwards. Once straight and firmly in place, you then bend a piece of wire into a tall U shape, trimming the wire so it's not that long. Then you just hook the two cars together. This is useful for a couple of reasons. As I said before, it's sort of a workaround for misaligned ends. The pieces of wood take up a much smaller portion of the opening than a proper coupler box does. But it's also nice because compared to knuckle couplers, it shaves off nearly half the distance between the cars. This feels a little more prototypical with such small jimmies. Now, the one downside is that you obviously cannot couple to knuckles using this system. However, if you're using these as a rake of cars, like I am, you can simply add KD148s to the end cars on your rake. Now, these couplers aren't perfect. It's easy to lose the wires, and I wish there was a bending jig for them. But in my case, it was a lifesaver. I wouldn't have been able to complete this project. And it does make the cars look nicer together as one unit. Continuing to make these operational, any good car needs proper weights. Unfortunately, these tiny cars hardly have the room. You need the space on the ends for the couplers, and some in the middle need to be used for the wheel axles. The dead center is basically the only spot you can put weights in the frames. I only really had the room to add a single quarter-ounce weight to each car. You can see on the test car how this barely fits with the wheels in place. Speaking of the wheels, those were a pain to get in place. The kit comes with brass roller bearings, which at this point of construction were a bit hard to add to the frame. Maybe in the future I should see if it's easier to add them earlier in the process. For the wheels themselves, I used KD110 HO 36-inch wheel sets, as the kit recommends. These were also annoying to get in place, as the bearings are supposed to hold them in permanently. Because of this, the axles had to bend to snap into position. That was really stressful to watch. This entire process was basically just shoving and praying. But with that, the cars were rolling. And so all that was left to do was build the tops of the car. The kit is supposed to come with car decks. Unfortunately, mine didn't, so I just had to make some for myself. For this, I used a stockpile of coffee stir sticks that my father grabbed for me back during our Michigan trip from last month. It's a surprisingly good source of wood. The sticks we got were about 3/16 of an inch wide, with wood glue adding a tiny bit of extra material, and therefore length. We only cut 10 pieces per car to cover the whole 2-inch deck. For the width of the car, we just cut each piece to length, roughly 1 3/8 inches. At first, I tried gluing the pieces together in pairs, and then gluing those pairs together as one big wooden deck. That was a hassle. I quickly realized I could just glue each board onto the car directly, and then push them together. This is what I did for the other 2 cars, though I did it off camera just so I didn't have to consider how I was recording the process. Speaking of which, I also realized while doing the other 2 cars that it was easier to paint the boards before gluing them onto the frame. It removed the chance of accidentally overpainting. Unfortunately, I only recorded this first car, and I did none of that here. Ah well, learn from your mistakes. And with that, it's time we focus on the actual gondola sides. We need a way to keep the candy on the car, right? Since the sides are less structural to the car than the frame, I decided to paint first, glue second. For the color here, I decided to pull out Old Faithful Cinnamon. It's been a while since I've used that tone. Unfortunately, as a custom color, it requires paint mixing to make. It's 3 parts Americana Cadmium Orange to 1 part Ceramcoat Territorial Beige. Now, the good news is, I did remember the ratios of paints needed to mix it. The bad news is, I forgot which paint was which half of the ratio. Oops. I wound up wasting more paint than I meant to, but eventually I got the cinnamon I needed. As the sides dried, I got a head start on painting the stakes a generic black color. I also painted the corner braces, which was a bit of a mistake. The material for the braces was far thinner than the stakes, and thus more prone to warping. In the end, this made it way harder to glue them on flat. Fortunately, I realized my mistake and only did 1 set of corner braces this way. So I had an opportunity to learn, and for the other 2 cars, glued on the braces before painting them. Now, yeah, overpainting was an issue, but I had my fair share of excess cinnamon paint to fix that. After gluing the 4 gondola sides together, making sure that the markings for stake alignments were facing outwards, I got to work gluing on said stakes. It wasn't anything glamorous, just more wood glue and positioning, really. The last thing to do was to add the handbrakes. They're actually pretty complicated. They include actual gearing, which I normally ignore. This time I only ignored half of it. Not that most people would notice anyways. After cutting the wire, I got the brake components cut and positioned on said wire, then positioned the whole assembly on the car, and used a little bit of CA superglue to get everything secured. It took some fiddling to get the CA right, and some excess got stuck on my fingers for a while, but even without paint, the brakes wound up looking pretty good. I did eventually paint the handbrake, though. I used Badger Modelflex Dark Tuscan Oxide Red, just like the other cars. And that's that. The cars are done. We don't really have many candies to put in them right now, but I do have some Skittles as a placeholder. I really like these cars. They make a great contrast with the rest of the train, which is mostly dark and drab colors. The pumpkin orange helps make these really pop, especially with the vibrant candies we'll be putting in them. And maybe the next project in this series also needs a little more color, eh? That's all for this week's video. Next time, we'll be finishing off the fleet with a little bit of animation. See you then. Cheers, folks.